Chapter 5. The Nephilim, People of the Fiery Rockets. Sumerian and Akkadian texts leave no doubt that the peoples of the ancient Near East were certain that the gods of heaven and earth were able to rise from earth and ascend into the heavens, as well as roam earth's skies at will. In a text dealing with the rape of Inanna/Ishtar by an unidentified person, he justified his deed thus: "One day, my queen, after crossing heaven, crossing earth, Inanna, after crossing heaven, crossing earth, after crossing Elam and Shibur, after crossing, the hierodule approached weary, fell asleep. I saw her from the edge of my garden, kissed her, copulated with her." Inanna, here described as roaming the heavens over many lands that lie far apart, feats possible only by flying, herself spoke on another occasion of her flying. In a text which S. Langdon of En Revue des Assyriologie et des Archeologies Orientales named, quote, "a classical liturgy to Inini," end quote, the goddess laments her expulsion from her city. Acting on the instructions of Enlil, an emissary who, quote, "brought to me the word of heaven," end quote, entered her throne room, quote, "his unwashed hands put on me," end quote, and, after other indignities, "me from my temple they caused to fly. A queen am I whom, from my city, like a bird they caused to fly." Such a capability, by Inanna as well as the other major gods, was often indicated by the ancient artists by depicting the gods, anthropomorphic in all other respects, as we have seen, with wings. The wings, as can be seen from numerous depictions, were not part of the body. Not natural wings, but rather a decorative attachment to the god's clothing. Inanna/Ishtar, whose far-flung travels are mentioned in many ancient texts, commuted between her initial distant domain in Aratta and her coveted abode in Uruk. She called upon Enki in Eridu and Enlil in Nippur, and visited her brother Utu at his headquarters in Sippar. But her most celebrated journey was to the lower world, the domain of her sister Ereshkigal. The journey was the subject not only of epic tales but also of artistic depictions on cylinder seals, the latter showing the goddess with wings to stress the fact that she flew over Sumer to the lower world. The texts dealing with the hazardous journey describe how Inanna very meticulously put on herself 7 objects prior to the start of the voyage, and how she had to give them up as she passed through the 7 gates leading to her sister's abode. 7 such objects are also mentioned in other texts dealing with Inanna's skyborne travels. 1. The shugara she put on her head. 2. Quote, "measuring pendants," end quote, on her ears. 3. Chains of small blue stones around her neck. 4. Twin, quote, "stones," end quote, on her shoulders. 5. A golden cylinder in her hands. 6. Straps clasping her breast. 7. The pala garment clothed around her body. Though no one has yet been able to explain the nature and significance of these 7 objects, we feel that the answer has long been available. Excavating the Assyrian capital Assur from 1903 to 1914, Walter Andre and his colleagues found in the Temple of Ishtar a battered statue of the goddess showing her with various, quote, "contraptions," end quote, attached to her chest and back. In 1934, archaeologists excavating at Mari came upon a similar but intact statue buried in the ground. It was a life-size likeness of a beautiful woman. Her unusual headdress was adorned with a pair of horns, indicating that she was a goddess. Standing around the 4,000-year-old statue, the archaeologists were thrilled by her lifelike appearance. In a snapshot, one can hardly distinguish between the statue and the living men. They named her the goddess with a vase, because she was holding a cylindrical object. Unlike the flat carvings or bas-reliefs, this life-size, 3-dimensional representation of the goddess reveals interesting features about her attire. On her head, she wears not a Milner's chapeau, but a special helmet. Protruding from it on both sides and fitted over the ears are objects that remind one of a pilot's earphones. On her neck and upper chest, the goddess wears a necklace of many small, and probably precious, stones. In her hand she holds a cylindrical object which appears too thick and heavy to be a vase for holding water. Over a blouse of see-through material, 2 parallel straps run across her chest, leading back to and holding in place an unusual box of rectangular shape. The box is held tight against the back of the goddess's neck and is firmly attached to the helmet with a horizontal strap. Whatever the box held inside must have been heavy, for the contraption is further supported by 2 large shoulder pads. The weight of the box is increased by a hose that is connected to its base by a circular clasp. The complete package of instruments, for this is what they undoubtedly were, is held in place with the aid of 2 sets of straps that crisscross the goddess's back and chest. The parallel between the 7 objects required by Inanna for her aerial journeys and the dress and objects worn by the statue from Mari, and probably also the mutilated one found at Ishtar's temple in Ashur, is easily proved. We see the, quote, measuring pendants, end quote, the earphones on her ears, the rows or, quote, chains, end quote, of small stones around her neck, the, quote, twin stones, end quote, the 2 shoulder pads on her shoulders, the, quote, golden cylinder, end quote, in her hands, and the clasping straps that crisscross her breast. She is indeed clothed in a, quote, pala garment, end quote, or, quote, ruler's garment, end quote, and on her head she wears the Shugara helmet, a term that literally means, quote, that which makes go far into universe, end quote. All this suggests to us that the attire of Inanna was that of an aeronaut or an astronaut. The Old Testament called the, quote, angels, end quote, of the Lord Malachim, literally, quote, emissaries, end quote, who carried divine messages and carried out divine commands. As so many instances reveal, they were divine airmen. Jacob saw them going up a sky ladder. Hagar, Abraham's concubine, was addressed by them from the sky, and it was they who brought about the aerial destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The biblical account of these events preceding the destruction of the 2 sinful cities illustrates the fact that these emissaries were, on the one hand, anthropomorphic in all respects, and, on the other hand, they could be identified as, quote, angels, end quote, as soon as they were observed. We learn that their appearance was sudden. Abraham, quote, raised his eyes, and lo and behold, there were 3 men standing by him, end quote. Bowing and calling them, quote, my lords, end quote, he pleaded with them, quote, do not pass over thy servant, end quote, and prevailed on them to wash their feet, rest, and eat. Having done as Abraham had requested, 2 of the angels, the 3rd, quote, man, end quote, turned out to be the Lord himself, then proceeded to Sodom. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, quote, was sitting at the gate of Sodom, and when he saw them, he rose up to meet them and bowed to the ground, and said, if it pleases my lords, pray come to the house of the servant and wash your feet and sleep overnight, end quote. Then, quote, he made for them a feast, and they ate, end quote. When the news of the arrival of the 2 spread in the town, quote, all of the town's people, young and old, surrounded the house and called out to Lot and said, where are the men who came this night unto thee, end quote. How were these men who ate, drank, slept, and washed their tired feet, nevertheless so instantly recognized as angels of the Lord? The only plausible explanation is that what they wore, their helmets or uniforms, or what they carried, their weapons, made them immediately recognizable. That they carried distinctive weapons is certainly a possibility. The 2, quote, men, end quote, at Sodom, about to be lynched by the crowd, quote, smote the people at the entrance of the house with blindness, and they were unable to find the doorway, end quote. And another angel, this time appearing to Gideon, as he was chosen to be the judge in Israel, gave him a divine sign by touching a rock with his baton, whereupon a fire jumped out of the rock. The team, headed by Andre, found yet another unusual depiction of Ishtar at her temple in Ashur. More a wall sculpture than a usual relief, it showed the goddess with a tight-fitting decorative helmet with the, quote, earphones, end quote, extended as though they had their own flat antennas, and wearing very distinct goggles that were part of the helmet. Needless to say, any man seeing a person, male or female, so clad would at once realize that he is encountering a divine aeronaut. Clay figurines found at Sumerian sites and believed to be some 5,500 years old may well be crude representations of such malachim holding wand-like weapons. In one instance, the face is seen through a helmet's visor. In the other instance, the, quote, emissary, end quote, wears a distinct divine conical headdress and a uniform studded with circular objects of unknown function. The eye slots, or, quote, goggles, end quote, of the figurines are a most interesting feature because the Near East in the 4th millennium BC was literally swamped with water-like figurines that depicted in a stylized manner the upper part of the deities, exaggerating their most prominent feature, conical helmet with elliptical visors or goggles. A horde of such figurines was found at Tel Brak, a prehistoric site on the Kabar River, the river on whose banks Ezekiel saw the divine chariot millennia later. It is undoubtedly no mere coincidence that the Hittites, linked to Sumer and Akkad via the Kabur area, adopted as their written sign for, quote, gods, end quote, the symbol, the goggles shown earlier, clearly borrowed from the, quote, eye, end quote, figurines. It is also no wonder that this symbol or hieroglyph or, quote, divine being, end quote, expressed in artistic styles, came to dominate the art not only of Asia Minor, but also of the early Greeks during the Minoan and Mycenaean periods. The ancient texts indicate that the gods put on such special attire not only for their flights in earth's skies, but also when they ascended to the distant heavens. Speaking of her occasional visits to Anu at his celestial abode, Inanna herself explained that she could undertake such journeys because, quote, Enlil himself fastened the divine me attire about my body, end quote. The text quoted Enlil as saying to her, you have lifted the me. You have tied the me to your hands. You have gathered the me. You have attached the me to your breast. O Queen of all the me, O radiant light, who with her hands grasped the 7 me. An early Sumerian ruler invited by the gods to ascend to the heavens was named Enmi-Duranki, which literally meant, quote, ruler whose me connect heaven and earth, end quote. An inscription by Nebuchadnezzar II, describing the reconstruction of a special pavilion for Marduk's, quote, celestial chariot, end quote, states that it was part of the, quote, fortified house of the 7 me of heaven and earth, end quote. The scholars referred to the me as, quote, divine power objects, end quote. Literally, the term stems from the concept of, quote, swimming in celestial waters, end quote. Inanna described them as parts of the, quote, celestial garment, end quote, that she put on for her journeys in the boat of heaven. The me were thus parts of special gear worn for flying in Earth's skies as well as into outer space. The Greek legend of Icarus had him attempt to fly by attaching feathered wings to his body with wax. The evidence from the ancient Near East shows that though the gods may have been depicted with wings to indicate their flying capabilities, or perhaps sometimes put on winged uniforms as a mark of their airmanship, they never attempted to use attached wings for flying. Instead, they used vehicles for such travels. The Old Testament informs us that the patriarch Jacob, spending the night in a field outside of Haran, saw, quote, a ladder set up on earth and its top reaching heavenwards, end quote, on which, quote, angels of the Lord, end quote, were busily going up and down. The Lord himself stood at the top of the ladder, and the astounded Jacob, quote, was fearful, end quote, and he said, indeed, a God is present in this place, and I knew it not. How awesome is this place! Indeed, this is none but the Lord's abode, and this is the gateway to heaven. There are 2 interesting points in this tale. The first is that the divine beings going up and down at this, quote, gateway to heaven, end quote, were using a mechanical facility, a, quote, ladder, end quote. The second is that the sight took Jacob by complete surprise. The, quote, Lord's abode, end quote, the, quote, ladder, end quote, and the, quote, angels of the Lord, end quote, using it were not there when Jacob lay down to sleep in the field. Suddenly, there was the awesome, quote, vision, end quote, and by morning the, quote, abode, end quote, the, quote, ladder, end quote, and their occupants were gone. We may conclude that the equipment used by the divine beings was some kind of craft that could appear over a place, hover for a while, and disappear from sight once again. The Old Testament also reports that the prophet Elijah did not die on earth, but, quote, went up into heaven by a whirlwind, end quote. This was not a sudden and unexpected event. The ascent of Elijah to the heavens was prearranged. He was told to go to Beth-el, quote, the Lord's house, end quote, on a specific day. Rumors had already spread among his disciples that he was about to be taken up to the heavens. When they queried his deputy whether the rumor was true, he confirmed that, indeed, quote, the Lord will take away the master today, end quote. And then, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and Elijah went up into heaven by a whirlwind. Even more celebrated, and certainly better described, was the heavenly chariot seen by the prophet Ezekiel, who dwelt among the Judean deportees on the banks of the Kebur River in northern Mesopotamia. The heavens were open, and I saw the appearances of the Lord. What Ezekiel saw was a man-like being surrounded by brilliance and brightness, sitting on a throne that rested on a metal, quote, firmament, end quote, within the chariot. The vehicle itself, which could move whichever way upon wheels within wheels and rise off the ground vertically, was described by the prophet as a glowing whirlwind. And I saw a whirlwind coming from the north, as a great cloud with flashes of fire, and brilliance all around it. And within it, from within the fire, there was a radiance like a glowing halo. Some recent students of the biblical description, such as Joseph F. Blumrich of the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration, have concluded that the, quote, chariot, end quote, seen by Ezekiel was a helicopter consisting of a cabin resting on 4 posts, each equipped with rotary wings, a, quote, whirlwind, end quote, indeed. About 2 millennia earlier, when the Sumerian ruler 𝐓𝐇𝐎𝐒 commemorated his building the temple for his god Ninurta, he wrote that there appeared to him, quote, a man that shone like heaven. By the helmet on his head, he was a god, end quote. When Ninurta and 2 divine companions appeared to 𝐓𝐇𝐎𝐒, they were standing beside Ninurta's, quote, divine black windbird, end quote. As it turned out, the main purpose of the temple's construction was to provide a secure zone, an inner special enclosure with the temple grounds, for this, quote, divine bird, end quote. The construction of this enclosure, 𝐓𝐇𝐎𝐒 reported, required huge beams and massive stones imported from afar. Only when the, quote, divine bird, end quote, was placed within the enclosure was the construction of the temple deemed completed. And, once in place, the, quote, divine bird, end quote, could lay hold on heaven, end quote, and was capable of, quote, bringing together heaven and earth, end quote. The object was so important, quote, sacred, end quote, that it was constantly protected by 2, quote, divine weapons, end quote. The, quote, supreme hunter, end quote, and the, quote, supreme killer, end quote. Weapons that emitted beams of light and death-dealing rays. The similarity of the biblical and Sumerian depictions, both of the vehicles and the beings within them, is obvious. The description of the vehicles as, quote, bird, end quote, windbird, end quote, and, quote, whirlwind, end quote, that could rise heavenward while emitting a brilliance, leaves no doubt that they were some kind of flying machine. Enigmatic murals uncovered at Tel Gasul, a site east of the Dead Sea whose ancient name is unknown, may shed light on our subject. Dating to circa 3500 BC, the murals depict a large 8-pointed, quote, compass, end quote, the head of a helmeted person with a bell-shaped chamber, and 2 designs of mechanical craft that could well have been the, quote, whirlwinds, end quote, of antiquity. The ancient text also describes some vehicle used to lift aeronauts into the skies. 𝐓𝐇𝐎𝐒 stated that, as the, quote, divine bird, end quote, rose to circle the lands, it, quote, flashed upon the raised bricks, end quote. The protected enclosure was described as Muda da Turtur, quote, strong stone resting place of the Mu, end quote. 𝐓𝐷𝐘𝐒, who ruled in Lagash, said in regard to the, quote, divine black windbird, end quote, the Mu that lights up as a fire I made high and strong, end quote. Similarly, Lu'utu, who ruled in Umma in the 3rd millennium BC, constructed a place for a Mu, quote, which in a fire comes forth, end quote, for the god Utu, quote, in the appointed place within his temple, end quote. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II, recording his rebuilding of Marduk's sacred precinct, said that within fortified walls made of burned brick and gleaming onyx marble, I raised the head of the boat, 𝐼𝐔𝐿, the chariot of Marduk's princeliness, the boat 𝐔𝐷𝐿𝐼𝐒, whose approach is observed, the supreme traveler between heaven and earth, in the midst of the pavilion I enclosed, screening off its sides. 𝐼𝐔𝐿, the first epithet employed to describe this, quote, supreme traveler, end quote, or, quote, chariot of Marduk, end quote, literally means, quote, high to heaven, bright at night, end quote. 𝐔𝐷𝐿𝐼𝐒, the second epithet describing the vehicle, clearly a, quote, boat, end quote, nesting in a special pavilion, means, quote, the bright Mu which is afar, end quote. That a Mu, an oval-topped conical object, was indeed installed in the inner sacred enclosure of the temples of the great gods of heaven and earth can, fortunately, be proved. An ancient coin found in Byblos, the biblical Jabal, on the Mediterranean coast of present-day Lebanon depicts the great temple of Ishtar. Though shown as it stood in the 1st millennium BC, the requirement that the temples be built and rebuilt upon the same site in accordance with the original plan undoubtedly means that we see the basic element of the original temple of Byblos traced to the millennia earlier. The coin depicts a 2-part temple. In front stands the main temple structure, imposing with its columned gateway. Behind it is an inner courtyard, or, quote, sacred area, end quote, hidden and protected by a high, massive wall. It is clearly a raised area, for it can be reached only by ascending many stairs. In the center of this sacred area stands a special platform, its crossbeam construction resembling that of the Eiffel Tower, as though built to withstand great weight. And on the platform stands the object of all this security and protection, an object that can only be a Mu. Like most Sumerian syllabic words, Mu had a primary meaning. In the case of Mu, it was, quote, that which rises straight, end quote. Its 30-odd nuances encompass the meaning, quote, heights, end quote, fire, end quote, command, end quote, a counted period, end quote, as well as, in later times, quote, that which one is remembered, end quote. If we trace the written sign for Mu from its Assyrian and Babylonian cuneiform stylization to its original Sumerian pictographs, the following pictorial evidence emerges. We clearly see a conical chamber depicted by itself or with a narrow section attached to it. Quote, from a golden chamber in the sky I will watch over thee, end quote, Inanna promised to the Assyrian king. Was this Mu the, quote, heavenly chamber, end quote? A hymn to Inanna/Ishtar and her journeys in the boat of heaven clearly indicates that the Mu was the vehicle in which the gods roam the skies far and high. Lady of heaven, she puts on the garment of heaven. She valiantly ascends towards heaven. Over all the peopled lands, she flies in her Mu. Lady, who in her Mu to the heights of heaven joyfully wings. Over all the resting places, she flies in her Mu. There is evidence to show that the people of the eastern Mediterranean had seen such a rocket-like object not only in a temple enclosure, but actually in flight. Hittite glyphs, for example, showed, against a background of starry heavens, cruising missiles, rockets mounted on launched pads, and a god inside a radiating chamber. Professor H. Frankfurt of cylinder seals, demonstrating how both the art of making the Mesopotamian cylinder seals and the subjects depicted on them spread throughout the ancient world, reproduces the design on a seal found in Crete and dated to the 13th century BC. The seal design clearly depicts a rocket ship moving in the skies and propelled by flames escaping from its rear. The winged horses, the entwined animals, the winged celestial globe, and the deity with horns protruding from the headdress are all known Mesopotamian themes. It can certainly be assumed that the fiery rocket shown on the Cretan seal was also an object familiar throughout the ancient Near East. Indeed, a rocket with, quote, wings, end quote, or fins, reachable by a, quote, ladder, end quote, can be seen on a tablet excavated at Gezir, a town in ancient Canaan, west of Jerusalem. The double imprint of the same seal also shows the rocket resting on the ground next to a palm tree. The celestial nature or destination of the objects is attested by symbols of the sun, moon, and zodiacal constellations that adorn the seal. The Mesopotamian texts that refer to the inner enclosures of temples, or to the heavenly journeys of the gods, or even to instances where mortals ascended to the heavens, employ the Sumerian term mu, or its Semitic derivatives shumu, quote, that which is a mu, end quote, sham or shem. Because the term is also connoted, quote, that by which one is remembered, end quote, the word has come to be taken as meaning, quote, name, end quote. But the universal application of, quote, name, end quote, to early texts that spoke of an object used in flying has obscured the true meaning of the ancient records. Thus, G.A. Barton, of the Royal Inscriptions of Sumer and Akkad, established the unchallenged translation of Gaudiya's temple inscription that, quote, its mu shall hug the lands from horizon to horizon, end quote, as, quote, its name shall fill the lands, end quote. A hymn to Ishkur, extolling his, quote, ray-emitting mu, end quote, that could attain the heights of heaven, was likewise rendered, quote, thy name is radiant, it reaches heaven's zenith, end quote. Sensing, however, that mu or shem may mean an object and not, quote, name, end quote, some scholars have treated the term as a suffix or grammatical phenomenon not requiring translation and have thereby avoided the issue altogether. It is not too difficult to trace the etymology of the term and the route by which the, quote, sky chamber, end quote, assumed the meaning of, quote, name, end quote. Sculptures have been found that show a god inside a rocket-shaped chamber, as in the object of extreme antiquity, now in the possession of the University Museum, Philadelphia, where the celestial nature of the chamber is attested by the 12 globes decorating it. Many seals similarly depict a god, and sometimes two, within such oval, quote, divine chambers, end quote. In most instances, these gods within their sacred ovals were depicted as objects of veneration. Wishing to worship their gods throughout the lands, and not only at the official, quote, house, end quote, of each deity, the ancient peoples developed a custom of setting up imitations of the god within the divine, quote, sky chamber, end quote. Stone pillars shaped to simulate the oval vehicle were erected at selected sites, and the image of the god was carved into the stone to indicate that he was within the object. It was only a matter of time before kings and rulers, associating these pillars, called stelae, with the ability to ascend to the heavenly abode, began to carve their own images upon the stelae as a way of associating themselves with the eternal abode. If they could not escape a physical oblivion, it was important that at least their, quote, name, end quote, be forever commemorated. That the purpose of the commemorative stone pillars was to simulate a fiery skyship can further be gleaned from the term by which such stone stelae were known in antiquity. The Sumerians called them naru, quote, stones that rise, end quote. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians called them naru, quote, objects that give off light, end quote. The Amuru called them nuras, quote, fiery objects, end quote. In Hebrew, nur still means a pillar that emits light, and thus today's, quote, candle, end quote. In the Indo-European tongues of the Hurrians and the Hittites, the stelae were called hu-ashi, quote, firebird of stone, end quote. Biblical references indicate familiarity with two types of commemorative monument, a yad and a shem. The prophet Isaiah conveyed to the suffering people of Judea the Lord's promise of a better and safer future. And I will give them, in my house and within my walls, a yad and a shem. Literally translated, this would amount to the Lord's promise to provide his people with a, quote, hand, end quote, and a, quote, name, end quote. Fortunately, however, from ancient monuments called yads that still stand in the Holy Land, we learn that they were distinguished by tops shaped like pyramidions. The shem, on the other hand, was a memorial with an oval top. Both, it seems evident, began as simulations of the, quote, sky chamber, end quote, the god's vehicle for ascending to the eternal abode. In ancient Egypt, in fact, the devout made pilgrimage to a special temple of Heliopolis to view and worship the benben, a pyramidion-shaped object in which the gods had arrived on earth in times immemorial. Egyptian pharaohs, on their deaths, were subjected to a ceremony of, quote, opening of the mouth, end quote, in which they were supposed to be transported by a similar yad or a shem to the divine abode of eternal life. The persistence of biblical translators to employ, quote, name, end quote, wherever they encounter shem has ignored a far-sighted study published more than a century ago by G.M. Redslab of Zeitschrift der Deutschen Morgenländischen Gesellschaft, in which he correctly pointed out that the term shem and the term shamam, quote, heaven, end quote, stem from the root word shema, meaning, quote, that which is highward, end quote. When the Old Testament reports that King David, quote, made a shem, end quote, to mark his victory over the Arameans, Redslab said he did not, quote, make a name, end quote, but set up a monument pointing skyward. The realization that mu or shem in many Mesopotamian texts should be read not as, quote, name, end quote, but as, quote, sky vehicle, end quote, opens the way to the understanding of the true meaning of many ancient tales, including the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. The book of Genesis, in its 11th chapter, reports on the attempt by humans to raise up a shem. The biblical account is given in concise and precise language that bespeaks historical fact. Yet, generations of scholars and translators have sought to impart to the tale only an allegorical meaning because, as they understood it, it was a tale concerning mankind's desire to, quote, make a name, end quote, for itself. Such an approach voided the tale of its factual meaning. Our conclusion regarding the true meaning of Shem makes the tale as meaningful as it must have been to the people of antiquity themselves. The biblical tale of the Tower of Babel deals with events that followed the repopulation of Earth after the deluge, when some of the people, quote, journeyed from the east and they found a plain in the land of Shinar and they settled there, end quote. The land of Shinar is, of course, the land of Sumer, and the plain between the two rivers in southern Mesopotamia. And the people, already knowledgeable concerning the art of brick-making and high-rise construction for an urban civilization, said, quote, let us build us a city, and a tower whose top shall reach the heavens, and let us make us a Shem, lest we be scattered upon the face of the earth, end quote. But this human scheme was not to God's liking. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of Adam had erected. And he said, quote, behold, all are as one people with one language, and this is just the beginning of their undertakings. Now, anything which they shall scheme to do shall no longer be impossible for them, end quote. And the Lord said to some colleagues whom the Old Testament does not name, quote, come, let us go down, and there confound their language, so that they may not understand each other's speech, end quote. And the Lord scattered them from there upon the face of the whole earth, and they ceased to build the city. Therefore was its name called Babel, for there did the Lord mingle the earth's tongue. The traditional translation of Shem as, quote, name, end quote, has kept the tale unintelligible for generations. Why did the ancient residents of Babylonia, exert themselves to, quote, make a name, end quote? Why was the, quote, name, end quote, to be placed upon, quote, a tower whose top shall reach the heavens, end quote? And how could the, quote, making of a name, end quote, counteract the effects of mankind's scattering upon earth? If all that those people wanted was to make, as scholars explain, a, quote, reputation, end quote, for themselves, why did this attempt upset the Lord so much? Why was the raising of a, quote, name, end quote, deemed by the deity to be a feat after which, quote, anything which they shall scheme to do shall no longer be impossible for them, end quote? The traditional explanations certainly are insufficient to clarify why the Lord found it necessary to call upon other unnamed deities to go down and put an end to this human attempt. We believe that the answers to all these questions become plausible, even obvious, once we read, quote, skyborn vehicle, end quote, rather than, quote, name, end quote, for the word Shem, which is the term employed in the original Hebrew text of the Bible. The story would then deal with the concern of mankind that, as the people spread upon earth, they would lose contact with one another. So they decided to build a, quote, skyborn vehicle, end quote, and to erect a launch tower for such a vehicle so that they too could, like the goddess Ishtar, for example, fly in a mew, quote, over all the peopled lands, end quote. A portion of the Babylonian text known as the, quote, Epic of Creation, end quote, relates that the first, quote, gateway of the gods, end quote, was constructed in Babylon by the gods themselves. The Anunnaki, the rank and file gods, were ordered to construct the gateway of the gods. Let its brickwork be fashioned. Its Shem shall be in the designated place. For 2 years, the Anunnaki toiled, quote, applied the implement, molded bricks, end quote, until, quote, they raised high the top of 𝐓𝐔𝐘𝐒, end quote, or, quote, house of the great gods, end quote, and, quote, built the stage tower as high heaven, end quote. It was thus some cheek on the part of mankind to establish its own launch tower on a site originally used for the purpose by the gods, for the name of the place, Obili, literally meant, quote, gateway of the gods, end quote. Is there any other evidence to corroborate the biblical tale and our interpretation of it? The Babylonian historian priest Berossus, who in the 3rd century BC compiled a history of mankind, reported that the, quote, first inhabitants of the land, glorying in their own strength, undertook to raise a tower whose top should reach the sky, end quote. But the tower was overturned by the gods in heavy winds, quote, and the gods introduced a diversity of tongue among men, who till that time had all spoken the same language, end quote. George Smith of the Chaldean account of Genesis found in the writings of the Greek historian Hestius a report that, in accordance with, quote, olden traditions, end quote, the people who had escaped the deluge came to Shinar in Babylonia, but were driven away from there by a diversity of tongues. The historian Alexander Polyhistor, 1st century BC, wrote that all men formerly spoke the same language. Then some undertook to erect a large and lofty tower so that they might, quote, climb up to heaven, end quote. But the chief god co-founded their design by sending a whirlwind. Each tribe was given a different language. Quote, the city where it happened was Babylon, end quote. There is little doubt by now that the biblical tales, as well as the reports of the Greek historians of 2,000 years ago and of their predecessor Berossus, all stem from the earlier Sumerian origins. A.H. Sase of The Religion of the Babylonians reported reading on a fragmentary tablet in the British Museum, quote, the Babylonian version of the building of the Tower of Babel, end quote. In all instances, the attempt to reach the heavens and the ensuing confusion of tongues are basic elements of the version. There are other Sumerian texts that record the deliberate confusion of man's tongue by an irate god. Mankind, presumably, did not possess at the time the technology required for such an aerospace project. The guidance and collaboration of a knowledgeable god was essential. Did such a god defy the others to help mankind? The Sumerian seal depicts a confrontation between armed gods, apparently over the disputed construction by men of the stage tower. A Sumerian stela now on view in Paris and the Louvre may well depict the incident reported in the Book of Genesis. It was put up circa 2300 BC by Naram-Sin, king of Akkad, and scholars have assumed that it depicts the king victorious over his enemies. But the large central figure is that of a deity and not of the human king, for the person is wearing a helmet adorned with horns, the identifying mark exclusive to the gods. Furthermore, this central figure does not appear to be the leader of the smaller-sized humans, but to be trampling upon them. These humans, in turn, do not seem to be engaged in any warlike activities, but to be marching toward and standing in adoration of the same large conical object on which the deity's attention is also focused. Armed with a bow and lance, the deity seems to view the object menacingly rather than with adoration. The conical object is also shown reaching toward 3 celestial bodies. If its size, shape, and purpose indicate that it was a Shem, then the scene depicted an angry and fully armed god trampling upon people celebrating the raising of a ship. Both the Mesopotamian text and the biblical account impart the same moral. The flying machines were meant for the gods and not for mankind. Men, assert both Mesopotamian and biblical texts, could ascend to the heavenly abode only upon the express wish of the gods, and therein lie more tales of ascents to the heavens and even of space flights. The Old Testament records the ascent to the heavens of several mortal beings. The first was Enoch, a pre-diluvial patriarch whom God befriended and who, quote, walked with the Lord, end quote. He was the 7th patriarch in the line of Adam and the great-grandfather of Noah, hero of the deluge. The 5th chapter of the book of Genesis lists the genealogies of these patriarchs and the ages at which they did, except for Enoch, quote, who was gone, for the Lord had taken him, end quote. By the implication and tradition, it was heavenward, to escape mortality on earth, that God took Enoch. The other mortal was the prophet Elijah, who was lifted off earth and taken heavenward in a, quote, whirlwind, end quote. A little-known reference to a third mortal who visited the divine abode and was endowed there with great wisdom is provided in the Old Testament, and it concerns a ruler of Tyre, a Phoenician sinner on the eastern Mediterranean coast. We read in chapter 28 of the book of Ezekiel that the Lord commanded the prophet to remind the king how, perfect and wise, he was enabled by the deity to visit with the gods. Thou art molded by a plan, full of wisdom, perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy thicket. Thou art an anointed cherub, protected. And I have placed thee in the sacred mountain, as a god wherest thou, moving within the fiery stones. Predicting that the ruler of Tyre should die a death, quote, of the uncircumcised, end quote, by the hand of strangers, even if he called out to them, quote, I am a deity, end quote, the Lord then told Ezekiel the reason. After the king was taken to the divine abode and given access to all wisdom and riches, his heart, quote, grew haughty, end quote. He misused his wisdom, and he defiled the temples. Because thine heart is haughty, saying, quote, a god am I, in the abode of the deity I sat, in the midst of the waters, end quote. Though thou art a man, not a god, thou set thy heart as that of a deity. The Sumerian texts also speak of several men who were privileged to ascend to the heavens. One was Adapa, the, quote, model man, end quote, created by Ea. To him, Ea, quote, had given wisdom. Eternal life he had not given him, end quote. As the years went by, Ea decided to avert Adapa's mortal end by providing him with a Shem, with which he was to reach the heavenly abode of Anu, there to partake of the bread of life and the water of life. When Adapa arrived at Anu's celestial abode, Anu demanded to know who had provided Adapa with a Shem, with which to reach the heavenly location. There are several important clues to be found in both biblical and the Mesopotamian tales of the rare ascents of mortals to the abode of the gods. Adapa, too, like the king of Tyre, was made of a perfect, quote, mold, end quote. All had to reach and employ a shim, quote, fiery stone, end quote, to reach the celestial, quote, Eden, end quote. Some had gone up and returned to earth. Others, like the Mesopotamian hero of the deluge, stayed there to enjoy the company of the gods. It was to find this Mesopotamian, quote, Noah, end quote, and obtain from him the secret of the tree of life that the Sumerian Gilgamesh set out. The futile search by mortal man for the tree of life is the subject of one of the longest, most powerful epic texts bequeathed to human culture by the Sumerian civilization. Named by modern scholars, quote, the Epic of Gilgamesh, end quote, the moving tale concerns a ruler of Uruk who was born to a mortal father and a divine mother. As a result, Gilgamesh was considered to be, quote, 2/3 of him God, 1/3 of him human, end quote, a circumstance that prompted him to seek escape from the death that was the fate of mortals. Tradition had informed him that one of his forefathers, Utnapishtim, the hero of the deluge, had escaped death, having been taken to the heavenly abode together with his spouse. Gilgamesh therefore decided to reach that place and obtain from his ancestor the secret of eternal life. What prompted him to go was what he took to be an invitation from Anu. The verses read like a description of the sighting of the falling back to earth of a spent rocket. Gilgamesh described it thus to his mother, the goddess Ninsun. My mother, during the night I felt joyful, and I walked about among my nobles. The stars assembled in the heavens. The handiwork of Anu descended toward me. I sought to lift it. It was too heavy. I sought to move it. Move it I could not. The people of Uruk gathered about it. While the nobles kissed its legs, as I set my forehead, they gave me support. I raised it. I brought it to thee. The interpretation of the incident by Gilgamesh's mother is mutilated in the text and is thus unclear. But obviously Gilgamesh was encouraged by the sighting of the falling object, quote, the handiwork of Anu, end quote, to embark on his adventure. In the introduction to the epic, the ancient reporter called Gilgamesh, quote, the wise one, he who has experienced everything, end quote. Secret things he has seen. What is hidden to man he knows. He even brought tidings of a time before the deluge. He also took the distant journey, wearisome and under difficulties. He returned and engraved all his toil upon a stone pillar. The, quote, distant journey, end quote, Gilgamesh undertook was, of course, his journey to the abode of the gods. He was accompanied by his comrade, Enkidu. Their target was the land of Tilman, for there Gilgamesh could raise a shim for himself. The current translations employ the expected, quote, name, end quote, where the Sumerian Mu or the Akkadian Shumu appear in the ancient text. We shall, however, employ Shem instead so that the term's true meaning, a, quote, skyborne vehicle, end quote, will come through. The ruler Gilgamesh, toward the land of Tilman, set his mind. He says to his companion Enkidu, quote, O Enkidu, I would enter the land, set up my Shem. In the places where the Shems were raised up, I would raise my Shem, end quote. Unable to dissuade him, both the elders of Uruk and the gods whom Gilgamesh consulted advised him to first obtain the consent and assistance of Utu/Shamash. Quote, if thou wouldst enter the land, inform Utu, end quote, they cautioned him. Quote, the land, it is in Utu's charge, end quote, they stressed and re-stressed to him. Thus forewarned and advised, Gilgamesh appealed to Utu for permission. Let me enter the land. Let me set up my Shem. In the places where the Shems are raised up, let me raise my Shem. Bring me to the landing place at. Establish over me thy protection. An unfortunate break in the tablet leaves us ignorant regarding the location of, quote, the landing place, end quote. But, wherever it was, Gilgamesh and his companion finally reached its outskirts. it was a, quote, restricted zone, end quote, protected by awesome guards. Weary and sleepy, the two friends decided to rest overnight before continuing. No sooner had sleep overcome them than something shook them and awoke them. Quote, "Didst thou arouse me?" End quote, Gilgamesh asked his comrade. Quote, "Am I awake?" End quote, he wondered, for he was witnessing unusual sights, so awesome that he wondered whether he was awake or dreaming. He told Enkidu, "In my dream, my friend, the high ground toppled. It laid me low, trapped my feet. The glare was overpowering. A man appeared, the fairest in the land he was. His grace. From under the toppled ground he pulled me out. He gave me water to drink. My heart quieted." Who was this man, quote, "the fairest in the land," end quote, who pulled Gilgamesh from under the landslide, gave him water, quote, quieted his heart, end quote? And what was the, quote, overpowering glare, end quote, that accompanied the unexplained landslide? Unsure, troubled, Gilgamesh fell asleep again, but not for long. In the middle of the watch, his sleep was ended. He started up, saying to his friend, quote, "My friend, didst thou call me? Why am I awake? Didst thou not touch me? Why am I startled? Did not some god go by? Why is my flesh numb?" End quote. Thus mysteriously reawakened, Gilgamesh wondered who had touched him. If it was not his comrade, was it, quote, some god, end quote, who went by? Once more, Gilgamesh dozed off, only to be awakened a third time. He described the awesome occurrence to his friend. "The vision that I saw was wholly awesome. The heavens shrieked, the earth boomed. Daylight failed, darkness came. Lightning flashed, a flame shot up. The clouds swelled, it rained death. Then the glow vanished, the fire went out, and all that had fallen had turned to ashes." One needs little imagination to see in these few verses an ancient account of the witnessing of the launching of a rocket ship. First, the tremendous thud as the rocket engines ignited, quote, "the heavens shrieked," end quote, accompanied by a marked shaking of the ground, quote, "the earth boomed," end quote. Clouds of smoke and dust enveloped the launching site, quote, "Daylight failed, darkness came," end quote. Then the brilliance of the ignited engines showed through, quote, "lightning flashed," end quote. As the rocket ship began to climb skyward, quote, "a flame shot up," end quote. The cloud of dust and debris, quote, "swelled," end quote, in all directions. Then, as it began to fall down, quote, "it rained death," end quote. Now the rocket ship was high in the sky, streaking heavenward, quote, "the glow vanished, the fire went out," end quote. The rocket ship was gone from sight, and the debris, quote, "that had fallen had turned to ashes," end quote. Awed by what he saw, yet as determined as ever to reach his destination, Gilgamesh once more appealed to Shamash for protection and support. Overcoming a, quote, "monstrous guard," end quote, he reached the mountain of Mashu, where one could see Shamash, quote, "rise up to the vault of heaven," end quote. He was now near his first objective, the, quote, "place where the Shems are raised up," end quote. But the entrance of the site apparently cut into the mountain was guarded by fierce guards. Their terror is awesome, their glance is death. Their shimmering spotlight sweeps the mountains. They watch over Shamash as he ascends and descends. A seal depiction showing Gilgamesh, second from the left, and his companion Enkidu, far right, may well depict the intercession of a god with one of the robot-like guards who could sweep the area with spotlights and emit death rays. The description brings to mind the statement in the book of Genesis that God placed, quote, the revolving sword, end quote, at the entrance to the Garden of Eden to block its access to humans. When Gilgamesh explained his partly divine origins, the purpose of his trip, quote, about death and life, I wish to ask Utnapishtim, end quote, and the fact that he was on his way with the consent of Utu/Shamash, the guards allowed him to go ahead. Proceeding, quote, along the route of Shamash, end quote, Gilgamesh found himself in utter darkness, quote, seeing nothing ahead or behind, end quote, he cried out in fright. Traveling for many Beru, a unit of time, distance, or the arc of the heavens, he was still engulfed by darkness. Finally, quote, it had grown bright when 12 Beru he attained, end quote. The damaged and blurred text then has Gilgamesh arriving at a magnificent garden where the fruits and trees were carved of semi-precious stones. It was there that Utnapishtim resided. Posing his problem to his ancestor, Gilgamesh encountered a disappointing answer. Man, Utnapishtim said, cannot escape his mortal fate. However, he offered Gilgamesh a way to postpone death, revealing to him the location of the plant of youth. Quote, man becomes young in old age, end quote, it was called. Triumphant, Gilgamesh obtained the plant, but, as fate would have it, he foolishly lost it on his way back and returned to Uruk empty-handed. Putting aside the literary and philosophic values of the epic tale, the story of Gilgamesh interests us here primarily for its, quote, aerospace, end quote, aspects. The Shem that Gilgamesh required in order to reach the abode of the gods was undoubtedly a rocket ship, the launching of one of which he had witnessed as he neared the, quote, landing place, end quote. The rockets, it would seem, were located inside a mountain, and the area was a well-guarded, restricted zone. No pictorial depiction of what Gilgamesh saw has so far come to light, but a drawing found in the tomb of an Egyptian governor of a far land shows a rocket head above ground in a place where date trees grow. The shaft of the rocket is clearly stored underground in a man-made silo constructed of tubular segments and decorated with leopard skins. Very much in the manner of modern draftsmen, the ancient artist showed a cross-section of the underground silo. We can see that the rocket contained a number of compartments. The lower one showed two men surrounded by curving tubes. Above them there are three circular panels. Comparing the size of the rocket head, the ben-ben, to the size of the two men inside the rocket, and the people above the ground, it is evident that the rocket head, equivalent to the Sumerian mu, the, quote, celestial chamber, end quote, could easily hold one or two operators or passengers. Tilmun was the name of the land to which Gilgamesh set his course. The name literally meant, quote, land of the missiles, end quote. It was the land where the Shems were raised, a land under the authority of Utu/Shamash, a place where one could see the god, quote, rise up to the vault of heavens, end quote. And though the celestial counterpart of this member of the pantheon of 12 was the sun, we suggest that his name did not mean, quote, sun, end quote, but was an epithet describing his functions and responsibilities. His Sumerian name Utu meant, quote, he who brilliantly goes in, end quote. His derivative Akkadian name, Shem-Esh, was more explicit. Esh means, quote, fire, end quote, and we now know what Shem originally meant. Utu/Shamash was, quote, he of the fiery rocket ships, end quote. He was, we suggest, the commander of the spaceport of the gods. The commanding role of Utu/Shamash in matters of travel to the heavenly abode of the gods, and the functions performed by his subordinates in the connection, are brought out in even greater detail in yet another Sumerian tale of a heavenward journey by a mortal. The Sumerian king lists inform us that the 13th ruler of Kish was Etana, quote, the one who to heaven ascended, end quote. This brief statement needed no elaboration, for the tale of the mortal king who journeyed up to the highest heavens was well known throughout the ancient Near East, and was the subject of numerous seal depictions. Etana, we are told, was designated by the gods to bring mankind the security and prosperity that kingship and organized civilization was intended to provide. But Etana, it seems, could not father a son who could continue the dynasty. The only known remedy was a certain plant of birth that Etana could obtain only by fetching it down from the heavens. Like Gilgamesh at a later time, Etana turned to Shamash for permission and assistance. As the epic unfolds, it becomes clear that Etana was asking Shamash for a Shem. O Lord, may it issue from thy mouth. Grant thou me the plant of birth. Show me the plant of birth. Remove my handicap. Produce for me a Shem. Flattered by prayer and fattened by sacrificial sheep, Shamash agreed to grant Etana's request to provide him with a Shem. But instead of speaking of a Shem, Shamash told Etana that a, quote, eagle, end quote, would take him to the desired heavenly place. Directing Etana to the pit where the eagle had been placed, Shamash also informed the eagle ahead of time of the intended mission. Exchanging cryptic messages with, quote, Shamash, his lord, end quote, the eagle was told, quote, a man I will send to thee, he will take thy hand. Lead him hither, do whatever he says. Do as I say, end quote. Arriving at the mountain indicated to him by Shamash, quote, Etana saw the pit, end quote, and inside it, quote, there the eagle was, end quote. Quote, at the command of valiant Shamash, end quote, the eagle entered into communication with Etana. Once more, Etana explained his purpose and destination, whereupon the eagle began to instruct Etana on the procedure for, quote, raising the eagle from its pit, end quote. The first two attempts failed, but on the third one the eagle was properly raised. At daybreak, the eagle announced to Etana, quote, my friend, up to the heaven of Anu I will bear thee, end quote. Instructing him how to hold on, the eagle took off, and they were aloft, rising fast. As though reported by a modern astronaut watching Earth recede as his rocket ship rises, the ancient storyteller describes how Earth appeared smaller and smaller to Etana. When he had borne him aloft one beru, the eagle says to him, to Etana, quote, see, my friend, how the land appears? Peer at the sea at the sides of the mountain house. The land has indeed become a mere hill. The wide sea is just like a tub, end quote. Higher and higher the eagle rose, smaller and smaller Earth appeared. When he had borne him aloft a second beru, the eagle said, quote, my friend, cast a glance at how the land appears. The land has turned into a furrow. The wide sea is just like a breadbasket, end quote. When he had borne him aloft a third beru, the eagle says to him, to Etana, quote, see, my friend, how the land appears? The land has turned into a gardener's ditch, end quote. And then, as they continued to ascend, Earth was suddenly out of sight. As I glanced around, the land had disappeared, and upon the wide sea mine eyes could not feast. According to one version of this tale, the eagle and Etana did reach the heaven of Anu, but another version states that Etana got cold feet when he could no longer see Earth, and ordered the eagle to reverse course and, quote, plunge down, end quote, to Earth. Once again, we find a biblical parallel to such an unusual report of seeing Earth from a great distance above it. Exalting the Lord Yahweh, the prophet Isaiah said of him, quote, it is he who sitteth upon the circle of the earth, and the inhabitants thereof are as insects, end quote. The tale of Etana informs us that, seeking a Shem, Etana had to communicate with an eagle inside a pit. A seal depiction shows a winged, tall structure, a launch tower, above which an eagle flies off. What or who was the eagle who took Etana to the distant heavens? We cannot help associating the ancient texts with the message beamed to Earth in July 1969 by Neil Armstrong, commander of the Apollo 11 spacecraft. Quote, "Houston, tranquility base here. The Eagle has landed." End quote. He was reporting the first landing by man on the moon. Quote, "Tranquility base," end quote, was the site of the landing. Eagle was the name of the lunar module that separated from the spacecraft and took the two astronauts and sighted to the moon, and then back to their mother craft. When the lunar module first separated to start its own flight in moon orbit, the astronauts told Mission Control in Houston, quote, "The Eagle has wings," end quote. But, quote, "Eagle," end quote, could also denote the astronauts who manned the spacecraft. The Apollo 11 mission, quote, "Eagle," end quote, was also the symbol of the astronauts themselves, worn as an emblem on their suits. Just as in the Etana tale, they too were, quote, "eagles," end quote, who could fly, speak, and communicate. How would an ancient artist have depicted the pilots of the skyships of the gods? Would he have depicted them, by some chance, as eagles? That is exactly what we have found. An Assyrian seal engraving from circa 1500 BC shows two, quote, "eaglemen," end quote, saluting a Shem. Numerous depictions of such, quote, "eagles," end quote, the scholars call them, quote, "birdmen," end quote, have been found. Most depictions show them flanking the tree of life, as if to stress that they, and their Shems, provided the link with the heavenly abode where the bread of life and water of life were to be found. Indeed, the usual depiction of the eagles showed them holding in one hand the fruit of life and in the other the water of life, in full conformity with the tales of Adapa, Etana, and Gilgamesh. Many depictions of eagles clearly show that they were not monstrous, quote, "birdmen," end quote, but anthropomorphic beings wearing costumes or uniforms that gave them the appearance of eagles. The Hittite tale concerning the god Telepinu, who had vanished, reported that, quote, "the great gods and the lesser gods began to search for Telepinu," end quote, and, quote, "Shamash sent out a swift eagle," end quote, to find him. In the book of Exodus, God is reported to have reminded the children of Israel, quote, "I have carried you upon the wings of eagles, and have brought you unto me," end quote, confirming, it seems, that the way to reach the divine abode was upon the wings of eagles, just as the tale of Etana relates. Numerous biblical verses, as a matter of fact, describe the deity as a winged being. Boaz welcomed Ruth into the Judean community as, quote, "coming under the wings," end quote, of the God Yahweh. The psalmist sought security, quote, "under the shadow of thy wings," end quote, and described the descent of the Lord from the heavens. Quote, "He mounted a cherub and went flying. He soared upon windy wings," end quote. Analyzing the similarities between the biblical El, employed as the title or generic term for the deity, and the Canaanite El, S. Langdon of Semitic mythology, showed that both were depicted, in text and on coins, as winged gods. The Mesopotamian texts invariably present Utu/Shamash as the god in charge of the landing place of the Shems and of the eagles, and like his subordinates, he was sometimes shown wearing the full regalia of an eagle's costume. In such a capacity, he could grant to kings the privilege of, quote, "flying on the wings of birds," end quote, and of, quote, "rising from the lower heavens to the lofty ones," end quote. And when he was launched aloft in a fiery rocket, it was he, quote, "who stretched over unknown distances for countless hours," end quote. Appropriately, quote, "his net was the earth, his trap the distant skies," end quote. The Sumerian terminology for objects connected with celestial travel was not limited to the mes that the gods put on, or the mews that were their cone-shaped, quote, "chariots," end quote. Sumerian texts describing Sippar relate that it had a central part, hidden and protected by mighty walls. Within those walls stood the temple of Utu, quote, "a house which is like a house of the heavens," end quote. In an inner courtyard of the temple, also protected by high walls, stood, quote, "erected upwards, the mighty Apen," end quote, quote, "an object that plows through," end quote, according to the translators. A drawing found at the temple mound of Anu at Uruk depicts such an object. We would have been hard put a few decades ago to guess what this object was, but it was a multi-stage space rocket at the top of which rests the conical 𝐵, or command cabin. The evidence that the gods of Sumer possess not just, quote, flying chambers, end quote, for roaming Earth's skies, but space-going multi-stage rocket ships also emerges from the examination of texts describing the sacred objects at Utu's temple at Sippar. We are told that witnesses at Sumer's Supreme Court were required to take the oath in an inner courtyard, standing by a gateway through which they could see and face three, quote, divine objects, end quote. These were named, quote, the golden sphere, end quote, the cruise cabin, the gur, and the alik maharati, a term that literally meant, quote, advancer that makes vessel go, end quote, or what we would call a motor, an engine. What emerges here is a reference to a three-part rocket ship, with the cabin or command module at the top end, the engines at the bottom end, and the gur in the center. The latter is a term that has been used extensively in connection with spaceflight. The guards Gilgamesh encountered at the entrance to the landing place of Shamash were called gurmen, and the temple of Ninurta, the sacred or most guarded inner area, was called the gursu, quote, where the gur is sprung up, end quote. Gur, it is generally acknowledged, was a term used to describe a sharp-edged object. A close look at the pictorial sign for gur provides a better understanding of the term's, quote, divine, end quote, nature, for what we see is a long, arrow-shaped object divided into several parts or compartments. That the 𝐵 could hover in Earth's skies on its own, or fly over Earth's land when attached to a gur, or become the command module atop a multi-stage apen, is testimony to the engineering ingenuity of the gods of Sumer, the gods of heaven and earth. A review of the Sumerian pictographs and ideograms leaves no doubt that whoever drew these signs was familiar with the shapes and purposes of rockets with tails of billowing fire, missile-like vehicles, and celestial, quote, cabins, end quote. Kager, or, quote, rocket's mouth, end quote, showed a fin-equipped gur, or rocket, inside a shaft-like underground enclosure. Esh, or, quote, divine abode, end quote, the chamber or command module of a space vehicle, and Zik, or, quote, ascend, end quote, a command module taking off. Finally, let us look at the pictographic sign for, quote, gods, end quote, in Sumerian. The term was a two-syllable word, dingur. We have already seen what the symbol for gur was, a two-stage rocket with fins. Din, the first syllable, meant, quote, righteous, end quote, pure, end quote, bright, end quote. Put together then, dingur as, quote, gods, end quote, or, quote, divine beings, end quote, conveyed the meaning, quote, the righteous ones of the bright, pointed objects, end quote, or, more explicitly, quote, the pure ones of the blazing rockets, end quote. The pictographic sign for din was this, a rocket looking like it's flying, easily bringing to mind a powerful jet engine spewing flames from the end and a front part that is puzzlingly open. But the puzzle turns to amazement if we, quote, spell, end quote, dingur by combining the two pictographs. The tail of the fin-like gur fits perfectly into the opening in the front of the din. The astounding result is a picture of a rocket-propelled spaceship with a landing craft docked into it perfectly, just as the lunar module was docked with the Apollo 11 spaceship. It is indeed a three-stage vehicle, with each part fitting neatly into the other. The thrust portion containing the engines, the midsection containing supplies and equipment, and the cylindrical, quote, sky chamber, end quote, housing the peoples named Dingir, the gods of antiquity, the astronauts of millennia ago. Can there be any doubt that the ancient peoples, in calling their deities, quote, gods of heaven and earth, end quote, meant literally that they were people from elsewhere who had come to earth from the heavens? The evidence thus far submitted regarding the ancient gods and their vehicles should leave no further doubt that they were once indeed living beings of flesh and blood, people who literally came down to earth from the heavens. Even the ancient compilers of the Old Testament, who dedicated the Bible to a single God, found it necessary to acknowledge the presence upon earth in early times of such divine beings. The enigmatic section, a horror of translators and theologians alike, forms the beginning of chapter 6 of Genesis. It is interposed between the review of the spread of mankind through the generations following Adam and the story of the divine disenchantment with mankind that preceded the deluge. It states, unequivocally, that, at that time, the sons of the gods saw the daughters of man that they were good, and they took them for wives, of all which they chose. The implications of these verses and the parallels to the Sumerian tales of gods and their sons and grandsons, and of semi-divine offspring resulting from cohabitation between gods and mortals, mount further as we continue to read the biblical verses. The Nephilim were upon the earth, in those days and thereafter too, when the sons of the gods cohabited with the daughters of the Adam, and they bore children unto them. They were the mighty ones of eternity, the people of the Shem. The above is not a traditional translation. For a long time, the expression, quote, the Nephilim were upon the earth, end quote, has been translated as, quote, there were giants upon the earth, end quote. But recent translators, recognizing the error, have simply resorted to leaving the Hebrew term Nephilim intact in the translation. The verse, quote, the people of the Shem, end quote, as one could expect, has been taken to mean, quote, the people who have a name, end quote, and thus, quote, the people of renown, end quote. But as we have already established, the term Shem must be taken in its original meaning, a rocket ship. What then does the term Nephilim mean? Stemming from the Semitic root nephil, quote, to be cast down, end quote, it means exactly what it says. It means those who were cast down upon earth. Contemporary theologians and biblical scholars have tended to avoid the troublesome verses, either by explaining them away allegorically or simply by ignoring them altogether. But Jewish writings of the time of the Second Temple did not recognize in these verses the echoes of ancient traditions of, quote, fallen angels, end quote. Some of the early scholarly works even mention the names of these divine beings, quote, who fell from heaven and who were on earth in those days, end quote. Shamhazai, quote, Shem's lookout, end quote. Uzzah, quote, mighty, end quote. And Uziel, quote, God's might, end quote. Malbim, a noted Jewish biblical commentator of the 19th century, recognized these ancient roots and explained them that, quote, in ancient times the rulers of countries were the sons of the deities who arrived upon the earth from the heavens and ruled the earth and married wives from among the daughters of man, and their offspring included heroes and mighty ones, princes and sovereigns, end quote. These stories, Malbim said, were of the pagan gods, quote, sons of the deities who in earliest times fell down from the heavens upon the earth. That is why they called themselves Nephilim, i.e., those who fell down, end quote. Irrespective of the theological implications, the literal and original meaning of the verses cannot be escaped. The sons of the gods who came to earth from the heavens were the Nephilim, and the Nephilim were the people of the Shem, the people of the rocket ships. Henceforward, we shall call them by their biblical name.
End of Chapter 5. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe for more. Also, please comment sequel below if you want to hear Book 2 of the Earth Chronicles series, The Stairway to Heaven.